Hi everyone, today is Wednesday, October 13th, and you are watching Discern with Jim Dennison. As always, we are joined with Jim. How's it going?
Hey, Jess, doing well. How are you today?
So great, so great. Well, we're just gonna jump right in. We're gonna be talking about football today, which, if you take one look at me, I'm just like the spokesperson for football. Love football. That was a joke. But yeah, we're gonna be focusing on football today. So this past Saturday was a big weekend for college football, if you are into college football. And it was also kind of a big week for the NFL. There were some headlines that were made. And so from the New York Times, Jon Gruden stepped down Monday as the coach of the Las Vegas Raiders football team hours after the New York Times detailed emails in which he has made homophobic and misogynistic remarks. The league is already investigating Gruden as a result of another email he wrote to Bruce Allen, who is the former president of the Washington football team, in 2011, in which he used racist terms to describe DeMaurice Smith, the executive director of the NFL Players Association, who is Black. So my initial thoughts after reading this article is, one, just sad and heartbroken for the people who these comments and derogatory things were made about. But then it got me thinking just how these emails had spanned, several years, and they're just now coming out as part of a different investigation. And it made me think, it reminded me that sin likes to stay hidden, but it doesn't stay, it will come to light eventually. Like Luke 12, I think 2-3 says that whatever is said in the dark will be heard in the light and proclaimed on the rooftops. And so that was my first initial takeaway. Jim, I'm curious what you first thought after reading this.
Yeah, exactly the same thing. Numbers 32:23, be sure your sin will find you out. There's a strategy behind this, though, that I think we need to pay some attention to, that something Christians may not be aware of. So, as a follower of Jesus, I have for a long time known that if I confess my sin to the Lord, he will forgive me for it. 1 John 1:9. So, if I'm tempted just by sins that I don't think are necessarily going to hurt anybody else, sins that I can keep private, might be sins of thoughts, might be sins in personal conversations or emails, such as is the case here, and I don't think anybody else is ever going to know or is ever going to be hurt by them, I'm perhaps more temptable to commit these sins. Well, here's what we're discovering. We're discovering not only that they will come out inevitably, as you said, what's private becomes public, but Satan's got a strategy behind this. I really think he likes to tempt us to commit sin that he plans to use against us in the future in ways we cannot imagine in the present. Jon Gruden, for instance, is at his dream job. I mean, he signed the most lucrative coaching contract in NFL history. He's going to lose $60 million as a result of having to resign this week. Who knows what his career's future could be? It's almost like the devil lets us climb this ladder, and we think we're getting away with it. We think it's secret. We think it was 10 years ago. No one will ever know. Well, it's like he's letting us climb this ladder till we get so far up the ladder that when we fall, we're going to hurt a lot of people going down and ourselves as well. So those that are hearing us right now need to be thinking, if you've got sin in your life, you haven't confessed, that you haven't repented of, things you think you're getting away with, you're probably not. There really is no such thing, as you said, as private, secret sin. And maybe the enemy plans to use this against us in ways that we can't imagine. Jon Gruden couldn't have imagined that he'd be today the subject of this conversation. So let's learn from him before his story becomes our story.
So obviously we see sin wanting to stay hidden play out in our lifetime. Do we see evidence of this, or where do we see evidence of this in the Bible?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's something we see there. And part of the reason the Bible's so relevant is that human nature doesn't change and divine nature doesn't change. So the way people were tempted in the scriptures, the way we're tempted today, what happened then is what happens today. So two examples that come to mind immediately for me, and I would imagine for most of us, in the Old Testament first, you think about David and Bathsheba. The enemy is off in the distance, and the army's off fighting the enemy. And Bathsheba's husband is off fighting in the army along with everybody else. And David's back by himself in the palace. There's a place there called the Mila. We take people there when we go to Israel that's still there. Parts of where we think this happened are still there. And David's there, and he sees Bathsheba, and he has this affair with her, and he thinks no one's going to know. And then she's pregnant. Well, then he thinks he can cover it up by bringing her husband back and having her husband go home and be with her, and then he and everyone will think the child is his. And the husband refuses to do that because his fellow soldiers are still at war. So then he arranges to have this soldier killed on the battlefield, so then she becomes a widow, and then he can bring her into his home, and everybody will think he's being very gracious in making her his wife so that she'll be provided for, and it'll happen so quickly that maybe the math kind of works, and people won't think that the child is the result of this affair. But God knows, and Nathan knows. And the prophet comes to David and tells David what Nathan could never have known, except that God revealed it to Nathan and from Nathan to David, showing us that even King David, for all of his resources, couldn't cover up the sin he thought he could keep secret. New Testament example, Ananias and Sapphira. So people in the early church are selling property and they're bringing the proceeds to the church to help people in need. And so this couple sells this piece of land. They bring part of the proceeds, but they pretend it's the entire amount. Well, who could possibly know? The church can't know unless they bought the land. They don't know what it's sold for. And the person that they sold it to wouldn't know what they gave to the church, wouldn't know that they were pretending it was the whole proceeds when it was only part. So what could it hurt? What difference could it make, they're thinking? But the Lord knows, and Peter knows. And Peter exposes to Ananias and Sapphira the sin they thought they had kept private, showing that humans do not have the ability to keep secret what we think we can. Just some years ago, I heard a preacher say something about sin I've never forgotten. He said, sin will always take you further than you wanted to go, keep you longer than you wanted to stay, and cost you more than you wanted to pay every single time. And if you think that's not true of you, you're being deceived right now. Those are words I really think we need to remember.
Jim, I would love to bring this back full circle and just apply this to Christians watching this today. What would you say to anyone who feels like they need to hide their sin or are afraid to come before the Lord and confess, who feel shame? Yeah, just what would you say to them?
Yeah, it's on two levels. First of all, the first thing we need to do is bring our sin to God. He already knows about it, of course, as we have seen. But when we confess it to him, we can claim 1 John 1:9. He says that if you confess your sin, I'm faithful and just to forgive your sin and cleanse you from all unrighteousness. Not just some, all. If he could forgive Paul for executing Christians or arranging their execution, he can forgive you, right? And then in Psalm 103, we learn that the Lord separates our sin from us as far as the east is from the west. In Micah 7, he buries it in the depths of the deepest sea. In Isaiah 43, he remembers it no more. You may remember it, but he doesn't. The second time you confess what you've already confessed, he doesn't know what you're talking about. I love this story that John Claypool, the pastor, used to tell. There was this priest who had this terrible sin he committed in seminary, and he had confessed it. He'd asked God's forgiveness, but he was still plagued by guilt about it. One day, a woman in his church came to him and shared this strange news that God had begun speaking to her audibly. Well, he was skeptical about that, and he said to her, well, next time God's speaking to you, ask him what sin your priest committed back in seminary. Not sure I would have done that, but he did. Well, she went off, said she'd do that. Came back a week later. He asked, is God still speaking to you? She said, yes. The priest asked, well, did you ask my question? She said, yes. And what did God say? She smiled and said, God said, I don't remember. So the first thing to encourage us to know is when you bring your sin to God, he forgives you, he forgets, separates it from you. Now to your question, when should we share it then with others? Well, that's really, we need the Lord to lead us here. We need God to give us discernment here. There are times when we don't need to share it with others. There are times when sharing it is going to make things worse rather than better. In Matthew 5, Jesus said, if you bring your gift to the altar and remember your brother has something against you, leave your gift at the altar, go be reconciled to your brother, then come present your offering. So if you know your brother has something against you, then yes, you're to take the first step in reconciliation. Matthew 18:15, conversely, Jesus said, if anyone sins against you, go to them. So if somebody has sinned against me, I'm to take the first step in seeking reconciliation. Now, they may not respond, but that's not on me. That's their responsibility, not mine. So if there's a sin against a person we're talking about here, or a sin against me by a person, then pray, Lord, do you want me to take that first step? And if so, how? Are you wanting me to go speak to them? Are you wanting to make the restitution with them like Zacchaeus did after he had stolen from the people in Jericho? Are you leading me to do that? Are you calling me to do that? In the 12 Steps programs that the AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, and other groups follow, they talk about making restitution where such is in the best interest of the person with whom you're sharing. Sometimes I unburden my soul to make me feel better, but it makes you feel worse. There are some times when confessing a sin to a spouse or a sin to a family member, a sin to a friend can actually make things worse rather than better. And so we want to have discernment here. We want the Lord to lead us. But the answer isn't to do just what's easy. The answer isn't to cover it up because you're afraid, as you said. Confess it to God, then ask God, Lord, do I have someone else I need to speak to about this? And if I do, open the door, show me how, bless me in that, and I will trust you with it. Those are hard words to hear. But the good news is, when we do what the Lord says, God honors, God blesses, God redeems all He allows, and we can trust His grace.
Thank you for sharing all that. And my final thoughts are just, Jesus bore all of our shame on the cross and took on that shame that He took it. And so just want to remind you guys that any sort of shame or condemnation is it's not from the Lord, and He meets us with arms of mercy. And just, that's why Jesus died, is so we could walk free from that shame. And so thank you for sharing your thoughts, Jim. I loved having this conversation with you today. It was very, very just life-giving for me, for sure. But that's all we have for you guys today. We will see you back here tomorrow with Jim.